So, justice. What is it? Why do we care? Well, part of why we care is because we do a bunch of debates about justice. And there are many things that you might care about or see in society. Had a bunch of justice debates on Monday night. How did people feel they went in the criminal justice debates? All right? Would have liked to know more about criminal justice? All right, hopefully what you'll see in this session will help you with similar topics. Half of these topics are in blue, half are in black. Does anyone have any idea why? Damn it, you got it in one, just to make it easier to read. All of these topics have in common that they're about criminal justice, and most of the themes that we're going to talk about throughout this session are about helping you build up a sort of toolbox of arguments and a toolbox of concepts that will let you look at any of these topics and pretty much instantly have a case ready to go on topics like this, to know right from the start what are going to be the most important things and have a sense for how to build those with strength. Alright, so I want to start with a slightly confusing overview of what the criminal justice system is as a whole. Down the left we have groups and we have functions on the top. So basically there are three real, I think most of you would know this, but I need to review. There are probably three groups that have an interaction and together make up the criminal justice system. They're the legislature, the people who make the law, the government. There are the police who enforce the law, and there are the judiciary who decide on lots of things. And the four functions that are really carried out by the criminal justice system are to firstly decide what is and what isn't a crime in our society, to then investigate when crimes have occurred, to ascertain whether people are guilty or not, and to look at those sentences. The thing I wanted to draw attention to here right at the start is that different groups have different areas of responsibility within this. So when it comes to defining the crime, the legislature decides what is a crime in our society, and we'll talk about how they do this later on. But interestingly, the judiciary also, at times, determines whether a particular thing is a crime if it's not clear in the law whether something is a crime or not. When it comes to investigation, it's pretty clear that belongs to the police. When it comes to determining guilt, that's the place of courts in our society. When it comes to sentencing, again, we see this link between the legislature and the judiciary, where law that determines what is a crime and what isn't sets standards of what a sentence can be as a maximum and minimum. But the judiciary actually decides on the appropriate application of that. And again, we will come back to that. So, what are the aims of the criminal justice system? I would say that at its highest level, the aim of our criminal justice system is to prevent crime and make people feel safe. But often for analysis, we split this down to another level, and we talk about four specific aims of the criminal justice system. Does anyone have any ideas what those might be? Sorry? Deterrence. Yeah, absolutely. Deterrence? No, someone else?
Retribution.
Punishment, retribution. Funnily enough, the same thing. Yes?
Rehabilitation.
Rehabilitation, fantastic. Protection, brilliant. Okay, so these are the four big things that we talk about in the aims of the criminal justice system. And I want to stress here, these are not the only four ways you could look at what criminal justice is. But the point is, if you look at each of those four things separately, you really together come up with, is this making society safer? Is this protecting society? So by looking at each of those four aims, you actually do answer what is it we're trying to achieve with the criminal justice system. So, what are each of these? Punishment, retribution is clearly the punishment that we do of the criminal. What are some of the ways that we punish people in our society? Yeah, prison is probably the biggest one. What else?
Fines.
Fines, excellent. Other things?
Community service.
Yeah, community service.
You can have like your car impounded now.
Sorry?
You can have like your car shredded.
That's true, you could have property confiscated. And under hooning laws, you could have your mum's car crushed. We don't, however, in this country use other forms of punishment or retribution, such as torture, caning, the cutting off of digits, as they do in some countries, or the death penalty. We avoid those here. What do I mean by protection of society here? Yeah?
We need to put make people behind the bars so that nobody will be safer.
Okay, so I'm asking for the really basic logical step. If these people are behind bars, society is safer. Why?
They will not be in society committing crime.
Fantastic, right? So it's really basic, but really important, right? It's a step of analysis that makes the difference. When you take one of these actions that we might under the criminal justice, does that protect society from the potential of these people committing more crimes? right? So yeah, one of the big reasons why we put people in prison is to do that. What do we mean by deterrence?
Preventing further crime of a similar nature?
Absolutely. So deterrence as a principle works by saying if we punish people for doing something, other people will see that and won't want to get punished in the same way, therefore they won't do it.
And that person will do it again as well, specifically.
Yes. So that person won't do it again, and that's where this breaks down a tiny bit. Deterrence has a little bit of overlap with rehabilitation. But that leads us to the fourth one. What is rehabilitation?
Making them fit into society better and stop them committing crimes?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, rehabilitation means that criminals won't commit. Rehabilitation at its core is tied up with the concept of recidivism. Does everyone know what recidivism means? No. R-E-C-I-D-I-V-I-S-M, I think. Recidivism means people... Huh? Yeah, that's right. So a recidivism is when someone is arrested for a crime, goes to jail, gets released, and commits a similar crime again. Or maybe another crime, but they're still committing crimes. And it's worse when it's exactly the same crime again and again and again. And rehabilitation is about trying to make prisoners not want to commit crimes again. And it's often about hitting the causes of those. So why are each... I guess what I'm saying is there's nothing sacred about this, but each of these are important. So punishment we're going to talk about more in terms of proportionality, in terms of justice, and about the sense of justice of society, to point out that rights can be taken away much as they can be granted. What are some other reasons why we might want to punish people?
We don't like them.
Yeah, we don't like them, it's fun.
They're politically inconvenient. They're politically inconvenient.
They're politically inconvenient, so we'll punish them into the ground. Yeah, maybe. I suppose lock them up to stifle their voice, but the people who do that would say that's protecting society from a dissident perspective. Yeah, to denounce what they've done, that's a bit deterrence. Another big reason why we look at retribution and punishment also has to do with the victims.
To validate their experience.
Yeah, to some degree. So victims we recognise, actually, we'll talk more about victims again later on, but in many cases under our criminal law we recognise that victims have rights too. And that victims deserve to see people who have hurt them punished in some way, shape or form in order to validate their experience, to acknowledge that something terrible has happened to this person, but also so that they see that justice has been done and can move on in some way, shape or form. Protection, I think we've already covered the why. It would be terrible if someone just committed a murder, we fined them all their money and then they just went on and committed another murder. Clearly the system would have failed in that case to protect society. And deterrence is important to reduce crime overall, and rehabilitation is important to reduce recidivism. So these four areas of criminal justice are something that you will find in basically every debate about justice. So I'm going to put a little question to the floor. For most crimes, the law enshrines harsher penalties for repeat offenders. Which of these principles would best be used to justify that action? So hands up if you have an answer. Say what and why. You at the very back?
I'd say protection of society.
Why?
Because if they know that it's going to happen again, then I guess putting them away is more of a deterrent.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in terms of protection of society, and I think the analysis you're looking for is when someone has committed the crime again and again and again, logic would suggest they'll do it again. Therefore, in order to protect society, we need to lock them away for longer because we can be more certain that they will reoffend, that they are a threat to society, right? So the same crime done the first time is maybe not such a big deal, right? If someone, shoplifts the first time, they're not very much of a threat to society because you imagine with a little punishment, nothing's going to happen again. But when someone's shown that they're a serial or compulsive person who does that, it becomes less and less likely that, it becomes more and more obvious that they are a threat to society, and therefore we have to actually remove them for longer and longer periods in order to protect society. Definitely. Any other answers to that?
Well, in the case of repeat murderers, which was funny when you think, life sentence doesn't mean much these days, but until they actually, judges use the term prospects of rehabilitation.
great, rehabilitation. So similar to what we just said before, but from a different principle perspective. If someone gets punished, we try and help them, they go out and they commit the crime again, the chances of actually ever being able to rehabilitate them in the future are much less, right? And again, that's why they pose a high threat to society. Any other answers? Yeah?
Okay, punishment and retribution.
Yep.
It's much less kind to repeatedly kill people than it is to kill one person. So you deserve worse punishment.
So what you'd say actually from even a, well, we were talking about do it in a serial fashion, we'd actually say that people who've been shown to have committed the crime, understood the implications, and yet do it again and again, are clearly committing a more and more immoral act, clearly less connected to society and deserve higher punishment. Definitely. I'd argue you can even put that down to deterrence, right? Yeah. So actually the answer is all of them. So, do the aims of the criminal justice system ever clash? Yes. Is the same answer. Can anyone suggest a really big clash between two of these principles?
Punishment and rehabilitation.
Punishment and rehabilitation. Fantastic. So, the principle of clashing between punishment and rehabilitation. The harder you punish someone, the more you isolate them from society, the more you dehumanize them, right? And the more you, make them feel trivialized and oppressed and remove their rights, the much less likely that they will feel connected to society, that they will care about society when they're released, and that they will actually have the chance to rehabilitate. So these aims clash. And a big part of the debate in world is about balancing these aims. So I'm going to put up a slide here, which is a little Tim Sonrak way of thinking about the aims of the justice system as being sort of about a pie chart. Okay, and you can't have everything, right? So if you have a policy that's 100% about punishment, chance of rehabilitation is almost zero. Okay, so this is the pie chart for life in prison. Okay, and real life in prison, non-parole, right? The chance of successful rehabilitation or the role that that plays in this is almost zero, right? Because they're not getting out. The punishment side is high. The protection side is very high, right? These people don't present a threat to society anymore if they're in jail. Interestingly, there is probably one thing that could have higher protection. The death penalty, right? So someone in jail could still break out, right?
You also check the inmates with the death penalty. They're inmates rather than having violent criminals locked up with other criminals.
Sorry?
Violent criminals locked with other violent criminals.
Right. You can just let them kill each other and that'll be fine. You can do that. We propose prisoner fighting cages as a way to reduce Melbourne's prison problem. Not in a debate. And the deterrence side of things here, recognise, I'll talk about deterrence a bit more in a minute, but yeah, we'll talk about that soon. Alright, so now I'm going to put up here the sort of pie chart for the medium length prison term. I'm going to flick back and forward a little bit. I'd like people to suggest perhaps why these things might look different.
If they're not in prison forever, there's a reasonable possibility that they could be released to society, and so they should be rehabilitated if they're going to be released to society.
Absolutely. So rehabilitation becomes really important. And the chance of actually, but more than that, the chance of rehabilitating these people is much higher because these people have something to look forward to, right? Someone in a life sentence has no incentive to work towards rehabilitation to a degree because there's no chance of them ever being released back into society. But someone in a medium-term sentence has a lot of motivation to work towards rehabilitation at the end of their 10-year sentence. Any other things here? Obviously the punishment's less, the deterrence less. Is the deterrent necessarily less? Well, the answer is it's a little bit less, right? Because you do get out at the end of the day. You can still live a life after that. But it's not a lot less, right? Because the incremental punishment of life in prison versus 20 years in prison versus 15 years in prison versus 10 years in prison isn't actually as big as people think. Because for most people, even 5 years in prison would be absolutely devastating, right? 5 years of being cut away from everything that they know, everything that is important to them. Right? In 5 years in jail, everyone you knew has gone on to do different things and change. In 10 years, your kids have grown up. Right? So the incremental deterrence is less, but not that much less. And interestingly, the way we've sort of drawn this chart suggests that the protection actually isn't that much less in most cases. Any suggestions why? Yeah?
Because until they're rehabilitated, they're a danger to society.
Yeah, well, basically, the rehabilitation contributes to the protection of society, right? So that if people are being released, but they're released safe, right? They've been decontaminated before letting out into society, then it's safe. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question here. What would the death penalty look like as one of those things? Yeah, the death penalty would be really high on punishment. So rehabilitation would be 0, like actually 0, because it's impossible to rehabilitate a dead person. Right, so protection would be high. But yeah, how big do you think deterrence would be relative to a long-term prison sentence? High? High? How much higher? I appreciate the mapping mode argument.
Well, because as you probably know, we had the death penalty in Victoria, I believe, until about 1967, and one of the main arguments against for abolishing it was that it wasn't a deterrent.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point. So there are a couple of reasons why the death penalty might not actually be as much of a deterrent as people think. Firstly, the incremental difference between the death penalty and life in prison, for most people, is not clear what the difference is, right? Like, you go to jail, you're cut off from everything, right? Death penalty, you're also cut off from everything. Now, there are differences, right? Life in prison, people can still see their families in incredibly limited and very controlled circumstances. But they lose a lot, and they lose it forever, right? For an absolute life in prison with no parole. The other thing about it is that deterrence as a concept is always slightly limited. Can anyone suggest any reasons why you could never come up with something that would be a 100% deterrent? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So in a lot of cases, people aren't entirely rational when they commit the crime, right? So murder in the heat of the moment, right? People just do it. They're not necessarily thinking, shit, I've killed my cheating husband. Well, no, as soon as they've done it, they're thinking, shit, I'm going to go to jail. But the moment in which they do it, they're probably not thinking about it. The counter to that is actually to suggest, however, that even in the case when people are absolutely furious and blind with rage, there's a little part of them that just knows that they're in trouble. So for example, when I get furious at someone, I don't punch them even though that's what I want to do, and I'm furious and angry because I know there will be a punishment. Yeah?
It would also be because people just don't expect to get caught. So like, of course, it's going to deter them because if you're committing a crime, you're expecting to get away with it.
Bingo. So crimes of passion, people don't get 100% deterrent because they're not 100% rational when they do the crime. But in the case of organised crime, where people are 100% rational within the factors that have driven them to crime, are 100% rational in planning the crime and in thinking about it, the deterrent isn't 100% for them because they don't expect to get caught, because they've planned it in such a way that they won't get caught, right? So you've got to realise that deterrence is, to use the build on the maths argument that was going back there before. Deterrence is like an equation where the deterrent effect is the multiple of the size of the downside, if you get caught, times the probability of getting caught, okay? So,
I like it.
yeah, so do the science people get that, right? And all the law students feel discriminated against?
Yeah.
They should understand this anyway. Okay? No, but so it really is. It's the probability that you'll get caught times the downside when you do get caught. And that determines the actual size of the deterrent effect on people. Did you want to add anything? You had your hand up before.
Oh, no.
Okay. So that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of deterrent. And the other part of that is actually to think about, so one way to increase the deterrent is increase the punishment. But what's the other way to increase the deterrent, based on what we just said? Yeah, absolutely. Have better police systems. Make it more likely that you'll catch people, right? So you don't actually necessarily need much harsher penalties in order to deter people if you can create a system where the probability of getting caught is really, really high, right? All right, so most debates about criminal justice are about balancing the competing aims of the justice system. And I think when you're taking a debate and you're looking at it from this perspective, what you'll find is you'll be able to make arguments about nearly every one of those criminal justice things from each side of the debate. How you win the debate is not just making an argument about each of those things, but showing the impact of this particular policy on each of those aims and explaining why each of those aims is more important in this case, right? Because of the people that are affected by it, right? Because of the size of the harm. So for example, in a debate about child rape, right? You might suggest that the harm to a child is so devastating for their entire future and life that we have to prioritise protection of society above the prisoner's rights to even proportional punishment in this case, right? So in different cases, you might suggest that rehabilitation is the biggest aim. Crimes that are primarily committed by people who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, like shoplifting, like similar, petty theft, right? You might want to suggest that in that debate, sure, all of these aims are impacted, but we think rehabilitation is the most important goal here, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of people who are doing this don't necessarily intend to be bad, they're just left out by the system, right? So just one sec, Peter. What I'm getting at here is that you want to try and, in a debate on criminal justice, you want to try and look at each of the areas, but then try and explain why the impact is big in the way you think, but also why each is more important.
Oh yeah, as you mentioned, low socioeconomic, here is the moment where I say, and the upper class twits and the thrill kills and etc.
Oh, absolutely, in many cases.
Crime, whatever.
Absolutely. So fun crimes perhaps should be punished higher, right? Like a crime that seems to be done purely for the thrill of a person with absolutely no need, you might suggest that punishment at the end of the day is more important, right? Or deterrence. Okay, so I want to do an example to talk about this. So the topic is that convicted pedophiles should be forced to wear tracking devices for the rest of their lives. Right? For the sake of what I mean, like a little GPS beacon that allows the police to know where they are at all times, and if they enter 100 metres of a school, an alarm will go off on the computer system and the police can go, check it out. Things like that. Okay? So, I'm going to ask that I think it can be made in this debate very clearly an argument for the app and for the neg on each of the four principles. So I'm just going to go through in turn and ask people to offer something. So firstly, in terms of punishment or retribution, does everyone want to take a few minutes to have a think about this topic? Just give people a few minutes. Try and think about how this would work. I'm going to split the room into app and neg. Actually, everyone from here, your app, your neg. Okay? You're on the app side. This empty row is the Great
So
Grand
Sahil's on the
Canyon.
neg, Joe's on the neg.
Okay? So app neg, and I'm not going to ask everyone, but I'm going to pick random people out. So I want you to have a think about an argument for each of the four things we talked about before. In terms of punishment, retribution, in terms of protection, in terms of deterrence, in terms of rehabilitation. Each side should be able to come up with an argument for each of those on this topic. Okay? We'll just take 2 minutes for that.
Where's the stallion?
Come and sit with me, Josh.
Each of these things.
I guess I know. Here, well, jump. Yeah, correct. Our time is Terry. Available in a special. Terry is so special. It's so special. It's really daft. Daft. Like you have to have 60 conversations with Terry, I'll be there at 2:30. And then look again, it's like, what do you come in for 2:30?
2 minutes.
Yes.
Ready to be picked on.
Are you doing Easter stage?
Pardon? Yeah. No, I'm going in. Yes.
Who's the replacement for Alison?
Please don't say that.
It's quite funny that it's like
Okay. Let's see how we rank. So, let's start with punishment or retribution. We have an argument from the app. Back.
For punishment, right?
Yep.
I thought that it might be a good thing because the prospect of having to pay for a crime for the rest of your life, the way what you did has effects on the kids you abuse for the rest of their lives.
Yep.
In a way, you ruin their lives, and yours is a bit ruined as well for the rest.
Yep.
I mean, I thought it was a parallel between what kids.
Yep. Absolutely. So you're saying there's just a sense of proportionality and justice here, right? That they serve their jail sentence, but it goes beyond the harm they did, and perhaps it should go on. Potentially. All right. One from the name on punishment. Yes.
Upon that respect, those people, those criminal offenders, they already punished by a punishment, right? Then they're released. So by adding a the device, it's like they're punishing them continuously.
Right. So what you're saying is they've already been punished. They went to jail for an appropriate amount of time, as was determined by a judge, and therefore they've done their punishment. No other crime do we continue to punish people afterwards. This would be unfair, out of proportion. Proportionality is really important for this sort of thing. Out of proportion with how we deal with other crimes. Great. One flip I might just add to that from the app is actually say, well, you know what? We can balance punishment with protection here. So people might be being punished for longer than they should be because we're trying to protect society from pedophiles. And therefore, if we allowed this, then we could actually release them earlier from jail at a fairer and more proportional degree of punishment while still tracking them. Anyway, that's my turn. I get to say that. Okay, without rebuttal. Okay, let's talk about, does anyone have anything else for punishment or retribution from the app?
Curtailing of rights.
From the app, yes?
They continue curtailing their right to be free from monitoring when thing. And so by continuing monitoring is a form of punishment. By curtailing their right to be citizens.
Yes.
Proportional to the crime and practice. They commit such an horror attack that they have a big impact to themselves of the child's life. That's going to continue that. They're like, we're going to continue punishing this proportional and it's continue.
Alright. Nate? Yep. David?
Just necessarily the idea that like for the actual victim involved, this is not like actually a step. The victim doesn't really want to think about the offender at all in this case. They're more interested in their own moving on. Punishment just brings back like I'm not sure how persuasive.
I'm going to move on. Let's talk about rehabilitation here. Can I get an argument from the negative for rehabilitation as a justice here? Someone who hasn't spoken yet.
Well, with rehab, we think that that's the most important thing because, like these criminals, they might have just made one mistake, and what we want to do is actually fix the problem and not just marginalise them for the rest of their life.
So is the argument you're making that branding them with a GPS transponder will marginalise them for the rest of their lives? It will make it harder for them to rehabilitate? Yep. So again, I'm just trying to put out there. So this is where you draw on what we talked about in rehabilitation, and the language and the analysis fits in here. So actually, we haven't talked about it. We will later. In terms of certainly in terms of their feeling, they feel ostracised and marginalised from society. Therefore, they don't have the incentive to get back in. Does anyone have an argument for the app on why this is actually good for rehabilitation?
It's kind of tenuous, just in that pedophilia is a kind of distinct crime. A lot of its causation can, or this theory that says it can be physiologically based as well as psychologically. So in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration in society, this is the best chance they have in that tracking them and ensuring they can't engage always going to be a certainty, whereas arguably rehabilitation doesn't exist on the same level in this crime as it does for others.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I think you can even go further and actually, stretch it, right, to being positive for rehabilitation, and actually say, well, one, this will allow people in the community to trust them more because they know that they're being tracked, right, and that means they're less marginalised as a whole. And secondly, that it maybe helps them control themselves, knowing that they're being tracked, which I think is what you were saying, right?
I was just going to add on to that and say a lot of pedophiles, well, you can claim that a lot of pedophiles don't want to be pedophiles, so they can't control. Like that's evidence that people, self-castrating and things like that.
Right.
So
this
they actually might ask for support in context.
Great. Right. The last one I'll talk about in our time is protection. Jackie, our argument for protection.
Protection of society, basically, because society needs to feel safe. Yes, giving parents peace of mind and protecting the vulnerable like children. But also, I think if you don't protect society and society doesn't feel safe, then you sort of almost create areas where you have lots of pedophiles, people move out of those areas because they don't feel safe.
Yep. I think that's really good, and that's something we'll come on to. I'm just going to cut it there. Neg on protection.
Just because you're blocking them from going within 100 metres of school does not mean that they can't find another kid anywhere else in the world. And because it's so useless to preventing them from seeing kids anyway, that it's actually no point preventing them from getting kids in this world. It doesn't make society safe.
Right, I think it's great, and it actually becomes harmful because people feel protected. Is that so rude?
False sense of security.
And why is that bad?
Well, just because it means people don't watch out for them in other areas because they assume that the ankle bracelet or whatever you're talking about is enough, and so that the job's done. And it means that people become negligent in.
I think that's the key. So what I'm pushing everyone on is take it further to show why it's good or why it's bad in this case. So society will end up being less protected because people feel protected. It means they don't watch their kids as closely. They're more likely to let their kids go out by themselves. And that means that kids are actually more vulnerable to pedophiles, even with tracking, than they were before. And hence, at the end of the day, society is less protected from them. Yeah, so what I was trying to show you that, can people see, just by doing that, by looking at the aims of the justice system from both the app and neg, we've already come up in 5 minutes with 3 solid constructive arguments to that topic, right? And that's how this first principle stuff can be really useful for you. Any justice debate you get, you'll be able to generate arguments on these if you try. Okay, so the next session I want to talk about is how to be hardline on saying we should punish people lots. I think there are 2 things here. One, to show why the punishment is necessary, like why there's a problem that we need more punishment for. And secondly, why punishment is proportional and appropriate. In proving the second one, I'm going to detour onto the rights of criminals. So criminals lose rights, right? They don't get freedom of movement when they're in jail. But they don't lose all their rights, right? Criminals still have the right to a fair trial, generally in most countries free from torture, but not always. Adequate representation, very dependent on the country. But we're talking about here. So how do we justify taking them away? Now, Mick wanted me to point out here that you have to be careful when taking away the rights of prisoners, because once you do, there's not many people who are going to fight for them to get them back, right? If you're talking about, unborn babies or disabled people, there are huge lobby groups that, try and fight for their interests. But very few people actually get out there and say that prisoners are hard done by, right? That the scum of our society are being treated badly. So, where does it come from that we can take away rights? Social contract theory. Fine. So, there are all sorts of reasons where rights might come from, and people who were in a MIT session the other week will know all sorts of ways in which one can generate rights. But the issue, basically, is that from a criminal justice perspective, it doesn't really matter what principal moral basis rights come from in the very beginning. It's very practical, that rights are a construct of a contract that we make with society. We give up the rights to do whatever we want in exchange for protection from people doing whatever they want to us, right? So the social contract principle of rights says, well, at its core, society would be anarchic if people didn't have a legal system. It would be anarchy, and people would run around doing whatever they felt like to anyone. Because we don't want to be raped by someone at any moment, because we don't want to be murdered, robbed, or stolen from, we in turn give up our rights to rape, pillage, murder, and so on and so forth, in exchange for this protection. And thus, we say that society actually has the ability to protect itself and all the things that make society good. And this is the key. What this is going to allow us to do is actually justify things based on the harm to society. We can take away individuals, people's rights. So, this is what it comes to, proportionality of harsh punishment. Some crimes are really easy to argue in favour of a harsh punishment, right? Things like we talked about before, child rape, murder, general rape, right? All of these are things that have devastating impacts on individuals, and therefore it's pretty easy for people to understand and justify, if you find general rape a confusing concept. Yes, just rape, okay? And in those cases it's very clear that there's a devastating impact on an individual, therefore there should be a harsh punishment on the person that did it. And everyone would accept that that sounds proportional, that sounds reasonable, it appeals to senses of victim's justice. But how do we deal with offences such as drug trafficking and property crime, where the impact on individuals may be, in many cases, lesser? Now you might say drug trafficking because, can sometimes kill individuals and therefore there's an individual harm. But, most drug traffickers aren't actually trying to kill their clients, right? So it's not the same as above, where we have this one-for-one, you do something bad to someone else, you should be punished. How can Singapore and countries like that then justify having such a hardline policy on drug trafficking? Yes.
The principal justification is deterrence.
Yeah.
And the need for deterrence stems from protecting society.
I understand that. I'm asking from a proportionality perspective, though.
From a proportionality
how do we make an argument?
Because drug traffickers usually traffic very large quantities of drugs, and the number of people who then receive those drugs, addicts, people, and some of those people may die, some of those people may just stay addicted. And even if they just stay addicted and they don't die, the fact that thousands of people potentially having their lives ruined by their addiction is proportional to having that person's life removed because of the fact that they're causing that,
yep.
that addiction.
Well,
I was going to say, also, I think you can argue that getting people addicted to drugs is like at least somewhere close to taking away their life. Like, obviously that's a hard sell to make, but I certainly think that there is the ability to suggest that it's almost proportional to taking away someone's life when you consider all of the factors that how it actually impacts on somebody's life.
I accept that. I think it's a very interesting argument. I'm asking, even if it wasn't drug trafficking, let's say it was just vandalism and property crime, that we might still want to get harsher at.
The impact on
why would we do it? Yeah.
Well, again, you can use like a social contract theory that the state provides like the idea that like the state provides like a mechanism for like the existence of civilization, you're part in it, that it essentially allows you to live. And by acting against it, you're like harming other people's ability to do that. You're harming your own, the state's ability to do that for everyone. And so it has a right to protect itself and everyone else by like,
Yeah, I think that's pretty much onto a final comment.
I think going back to the deterrence and the equation of risk of getting caught versus consequence, in those situations, the risk of getting caught with really minor offences like stealing lollies and stuff in the supermarket, vandalism, is pretty small. So in order to create that deterrent, they have to up the consequence.
Yep. It's a very interesting point on deterrence, which we'll come back to. What I'm trying to get at here, though, is building on social contract is actually to suggest that these things that seem like little crimes in and of themselves, but when they add up and the size of the impact and the thousands of people that are affected, actually cause breakdowns across society, right? So the justification that the Singaporean government would use in many cases to say drug trafficking, even when it's not causing individual deaths, causes the breakdown of society because it causes fights within families, it causes people to drop out of jobs, like drug addiction becomes a curse on all of society. And that harm to society therefore says, in its own protection, society can take away these rights to you because you're not playing fair in your social contract. And if you wanted to put the example, well, Singapore doesn't even have chewing gum on their streets. Anyway, harsh punishment. The second part is about necessity. So establishing a problem that needs fixing. The issue for this, I'll go back to the previous slide, is that most developed countries have crime rates that are actually falling. So how do you set up that there's an imperative to actually get harsher on crime? Do you lie?
Yes.
There's a perception that...
No!
Oh, wait, it's on this slide.
Okay,
I don't
good.
really answer
Perception. Alright, so the answer is you never lie, right? You don't say that, oh, actually there has been an epidemic of crime. If only you read The Age last night, you would have seen that 50,000 people were mugged simultaneously by a gang of armed bandits. You don't do that. The answer is that sometimes it is necessary to be harsh on crime, not just because crime is getting worse, but because people think crime is getting worse. So, 3 reasons for that. I might ask people to come up with some reasons first. Can anyone? No, running out of time. I'm just going to go through this. Okay, 3 reasons why public perception actually matters. Right? Because at the end of the day, it sounds pretty lame to say, people don't just need to be safe, people need to feel safe. Great, that's a really important principle, but if you just say that, it doesn't sound like people feeling safe is a reason why you should, crack down on petty criminals with mandatory sentencing. 3 real reasons. 1 is that feeling unsafe inhibits the ability of people to exercise their rights. Exercise their rights. I excised from exercise.
You're a loser.
Okay. So, can anyone suggest an example of why, if you didn't feel safe, your rights would be limited?
Like maybe on a train to Frankston at night because you'll get stabbed.
Absolutely. So you don't want to go to Frankston late at night because you think you'll get stabbed. That means that you can't come to debating on Monday nights if it finishes after 9 o'clock. Jackie faces this problem every day because she doesn't feel safe on the trains. Actually, she goes anyway, but because her love of debating is higher than her personal safety. But not everyone makes that decision, right? And I think the important thing here is that it's all well and good for the government to say, oh no, we are protecting your rights because no one would ever actually get you because we'd catch that person first. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to go out and enjoy all the freedoms that society is supposed to be providing for you. So that's not good enough. That's not actually having a society protect freedoms and rights to everyone, right? Yeah.
Similarly, I guess, if you felt like none of the laws were enforced, or there was this perception that they weren't going to be enforced, then you would have the converse, like you would have a rise in dramatic crime and stuff, but also you would have people who felt like they had little enforcement justice, like less likely to report, less likely to...
I think that's really good. So the second part, the first part of that, sorry, that if people feel like the law's not working, the deterrent effect of the law is actually minimised. Right? That's a really interesting point. The perception of the law matters because deterrent at the end of the day happens not because people read the law that they're about to break. It happens because people have a general perception of what the consequences are. The second part of that is really interesting, and it's actually a part I left out in the second one. So what do people do when the justice system feels inadequate? One of those Carmel just said, when people feel justice isn't inadequate, they don't report crimes to police. They don't come forward with information because they're afraid for their own safety, and hence crime actually does increase because we can't effectively police it.
Also, people might just not bother if they think the cop's just going to sit down and have another donut if you report crime.
Absolutely. Right, and the biggest harm that can come from that is actually vigilante justice. What's a vigilante? Batman, right? And interestingly, that's a bit of a tough one for us because Batman is the hero, right? And yet the cops are always trying to get him, right? And that recognises, I guess, that vigilantes... Sorry.
Oh, in the TV series that I grew up with, I thought the cops like it.
Ah, well, the modern Batman is a little bit darker. Right?
You don't get dancers.
And the interesting thing about vigilantism, right, is that if vigilantes were always right, then actually, you know what, maybe it'd be okay, but they're not, right? That's why we have a justice system. That's why we have trials, because no one honestly knows who's guilty and who's not. Richard?
Can you define vigilantes for something?
Yes, okay, sorry. So for those who don't, for whom the Batman definition does not suffice, vigilantes are people who take justice into their own hands. So a vigilante is someone who says, I know this person is guilty of theft, of rape, of destroying our city, and the police force hasn't done anything about it, our system has not done anything, I'm going to go kill them myself. Right? Things like that. That's effectively what a vigilante is. People who take justice into their own hands. And that's really problematic, because it turns people who are trying to do the right thing into criminals, right? Because a vigilante is no less a murderer because they're murdering another murderer, right? And also that it means that people drift further away from the justice system. The final part is a little bit of a stretch idea, but pretty cool, is that if people don't feel safe, that can sometimes cause crime areas to develop through demographic change. So it's a little bit like in New York, where ghettos have formed in places because people started to feel unsafe because of perceptions of rising crime within their community that they saw as coming about because of high levels of vandalism, even if they weren't actually at threat themselves, right? Even if their safety wasn't actually at risk, they felt at risk because they saw vandalism. People move out of those communities, who would otherwise be law-abiding, and more you get concentrations of people who fall into criminal culture. And that can be incredibly damaging for districts where that happens. Going to move on. Going soft. How to focus on rehabilitation should this happen to you. No, how to... I'm glad some people at least are laughing at my jokes tonight. Okay, so combating perceptions. Well, one, it's worth pointing out in a debate like this that whatever people think, crime rates are falling, and that is the most important thing. Second, to point out that society is not actually soft on crime either. That in many crimes, the incarceration rate is actually increasing. So for example, when it comes to culpable driving, there's only like 50% of people who are accused of culpable driving were in prison in the 1980s, 90s, and now it's close to 77% are actually incarcerated. And they're not getting off lightly either. Judges aren't actually as much out of touch as people think. And that's the third part. People say, have you ever heard people say judges are out of touch with the community, the judges don't know what they're doing, giving soft sentences? Right? A really interesting part of this is actually that when people know the full facts of the case, they tend to often be more lenient than the judges when it comes to sentences. And this has been backed up by a number of studies, most recently at Melbourne University, a few years ago. Another reason why rehabilitation is important is because rehabilitation reduces crime. I said it works. Can anyone suggest why rehabilitation works?
Reduces recidivism.
Yes. How does it reduce recidivism?
Because they're rehabilitated.
Move on to thanks.
Okay, so what I want to ask is how do people become rehabilitated to the point where they are no longer a threat to society? And in fact, even better, they might become productive members of society when they leave jail. How do we rehabilitate people?
Give them something to forward to afterwards.
Give them some stake in the state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. We'll actually, I'm jumping ahead. We'll come back to it. Okay, so other reasons why, we'll come back to that. Other reasons why it's great is because not only does it reduce crime, that is great. It's also important because it saves government from the extremely high cost of incarceration, which costs a fortune. Yes,
I think there's also an argument that incarceration does the opposite. I think that's part of that argument. Like that incarceration hardens people to be like real criminals, not petty criminals, that kind of stuff.
Right. I'll come to that in a sec. I just want to point out here that we need rehab to work. So particularly, like there have been debates in America about rising prison populations and things like that. Like they're building new prisons. I don't know how often, but like, you know, a lot. Kieran, you know about America.
What?
Prison.
Alright, moving on.
Yeah, prison numbers are going through the roof in America.
When you're talking about
we actually need rehab to work. Okay, so this is the question I was trying to get to. Where does rehab actually work the best? Right? So part of this is the question of, well, how does rehabilitation work? Yeah, as we discussed before, it works by changing people's mindset to where they no longer see themselves wanting to do something against the community, but to be part of the community in various ways. And there are a number of ways in which it actually does that, right? So programs that are used in rehabilitation tend to try and address the cause of crime in many cases. So it might be for people who ended up falling into organised crime because they just have no skills and training, what might we do for them in prisons? Yeah, fantastic. So in Australia, you can actually take courses in prison, right? Some people would say, oh, you're letting them get a free education and you don't let us get a free education, right? But it's an important part of rehabilitating these people so that when they don't leave, they don't go back. But yeah, the question is, where does this work best? So when people are in prison, why might that not be the best place for rehabilitation to work?
Because they're surrounded by murderers.
Yeah. Okay, so often people who go into jail for lesser crimes are surrounded by people who are there for much more serious crimes. Okay? And people can meet members of organised crime rings as well.
Yes, Bluestone College is called it.
Oh, right, yeah, right. Training grounds for how to be criminals.
Exactly. And also,
yeah, go to jail and you sort of share techniques.
And also for the young kids, from Tirana or whatever to go there. And
absolutely.
But the other thing, of course, being that when you say if they're in prison for a long time, it's hard, as you said, 5 years of life's moved on. Yeah. It's hard for them to make a go, but so who do they hook up with? But
absolutely.
Other criminals.
Yeah, and so I guess what I want to get at here is you want to think about what are things that can be done in jail to make rehab better, right? So how, what are some debates that might look into that? One, there are topics about allowing prisoners to have conjugal visits. I don't really want to have to define conjugal, but that means allowing their wives or husbands to come to jail and have sex with them in a room, right?
I don't really want to define it, but here's what it is.
A special sex room, basically, right?
Special sex room.
But, you know, rehab is a big reason why. It's exciting, I know, but, you know, and it would probably be recorded on CCTV for safety, but so far I haven't seen any conjugate visits.
Just keep walking out.
So, you know, how does that help rehabilitation? It helps by keeping people's relationships alive in many cases. It keeps them connected with what's going on. There are topics that women should be allowed to raise their children behind bars. Sounds like a crazy idea that you let their toddlers go into prison with them, right? Obviously, you wouldn't do that in, you know, like a prison full of murderers. You might have a separate prison.
Oh,
But it helps them connect. Right, but the other thing you've got onto is, where does rehabilitation work best? And the answer is in most cases not in prison. And that's why you have debates about more and more different types of crimes should be dealt with in particular areas, in diversionary centres, which means something. What do they mean?
Diversionary
Yeah.
centres. I'm not really sure what diversionary centre is, but a diversionary program is trying to give people access to like drug and alcohol treatment, that kind of thing, to try and change their mindset, stopping community crime in that way.
Correct. And then community-based orders and things like that can actually be ways to punish people with that kind of jail. Okay. Yes.
Has trafficking, just as a recent development there, the Attorney General Rob Hulls is proposing abolishing suspended sentences. So that's one aspect of trying to keep prisoners out of jail with the threat of possibly going in if they commit within that suspended sentence. So yeah, but they're trying to get rid of it now because it's received huge criticism.
He's point keeping them.
Yeah.
Right. So a suspended sentence is where we say you deserve 2 years in jail, but we won't send you to jail as long as you don't reoffend within that period. Clearly, there's a fantastic rehabilitation incentive there. The flip side, you could look at very quickly and say is probably people don't feel safe, and that probably doesn't protect society in many cases where people who are actually dangerous criminals are let go on suspended sentences.
And deterrence as well.
Deterrence, absolutely.
In the same vein, the Liberal opposition wants to get rid of home detention as well,
Right.
which is used to a limited extent in Victoria.
Yeah. Is that used for adults or only children?
No, it's adults.
Adults as well. Yeah.
The guy that tax evasion, John Farnham.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, so at-home detention is another way of limiting people. Don't send them to jail, just restrict their freedom of movement and punish them by forcing them to not leave home for X months.
Watch Foxtel.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds like a really harsh punishment for people. But it can be. It depends whether their computer knows to live on World of Warcraft, in which case it's no punishment because it's no different to their normal life. Or not. Okay, so the next section is really just a whole lot of factoids that I think are interesting and useful for particular debates. So I'm going to have to move very quickly. So sentencing. So our system preserves significant judicial discretion in sentencing. Partly this is a safeguard. It means, well, the reason we do it is because in order to meet the aims of the justice system, each person needs to be dealt with differently. So let's take the case of someone who murders in a fit of passion and someone who is a contract killer. Right? If we look at the need to protect society, which one of those might be getting a harsher sentence?
The irrational. Yes,
You're right, the irrational people, oh my god, they might not be atheists as well. No, right? Clearly the contract killer poses a higher risk to society because they've shown that they've shown that they're willing to do this for profit, and that motive doesn't go away. The other reason that we have a lot of discretion in sentencing is because our general legal system is compassionate, particularly from a rehabilitation perspective. That's important. To recognise why people have committed crimes, under what pressure, helps you assess their prospects of rehabilitation. Right? Someone who commits a crime with no major pressure to do so is much less likely to be easily rehabilitated than someone who's been driven to crime as a result of poverty, as a result of social factors that have pushed them in that way. I had something else I really wanted to talk about on sentencing.
So 5 aims.
What?
5 aims of sentencing.
No, that's too complicated. That was thinking, yeah. Oh yeah, what I also wanted to talk about with sentencing is that sentencing has to mean something to the person. So if we want sentences to be effective, we want to think about whether the sentence handed out is actually going to be received as it's intended by the person. So we have debates about Koori courts and Indigenous courts, because the aim of Koori courts is to set sentences for Indigenous people living in Indigenous communities that have more cultural impact for them than the sentences that they might be getting as a result of standard laws. We also, for example, this is my dumb example, but for example, the death penalty is probably not a great sentence actually to be giving for attempted suicide bombers, right? Because they're martyrs either way, right? Life in jail is actually a much bigger deterrent. Anyway, factoid within a factoid. How much role should victims have in sentencing? Some jurisdictions allow victims to write an impact statement that actually tells the judge, I was hurt in this way, I think they should be punished more. Or I actually forgive them even though they hurt me, they should be punished less. Some jurisdictions will let that be taken into account as part of the retribution balance, others won't. Should it not? Prisons, we've already talked about. Lawyers, yes? I believe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, anyone could give a victim impact statement. Yeah. That doesn't necessarily get read out, it's up to the prosecution.
Absolutely. The status quo could be anyway. So, lawyers. It would be great if our legal system could just determine who is guilty of innocent or not, but actually lawyers play a factor in it. The Australian legal system is primarily adversarial. This means that judges and juries can only decide on what is presented to them in the court. The judges cannot go out themselves and do investigative research, even if they think to some degree that it would be nice to know more about particular things. Thus, lawyers play a crucial role, right? There is such a thing as a good lawyer and a bad lawyer. What does this say about the fairness of our justice system? Any comments? Tom, you smirked?
Well, it certainly favours the ones who find themselves with a very impressive lawyer over the ones who just sort of got turfed to the cheapest guy they could find.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, look, in most cases, the truth or justice will be done, right? It's only in very close cases where a good lawyer or a bad lawyer could sway the judge or jury in that way. So you don't want to go all out and out. Like if someone's clearly innocent, clearly guilty, it won't change. But in those close cases, a lot of evidence suggests that a good lawyer can make the difference.
Well, even then, like a good lawyer can reduce the impact of sentencing, can do a whole number of things that they,
Great.
Benefit their client.
So, I'm bringing this up because there are topics, like we had at Worlds a few years ago, that all people should use a state-provided lawyer, right? So you want to think, is it actually a fair system that we have right now that allows people to choose their own lawyers, or is it unfair? As it turns out, for high-profile cases, the government's actually pretty good about the government hiring really good lawyers as well for really high-profile cases, but in many cases it doesn't. The alternative, by the way, is like an inquisitory system, which is used in many European countries, where the judge can actually request, in particular, investigations to be done and find more, and that lawyers play a slightly different role there. A couple of other things just to prime you for debates. Juries. Anyone doesn't know what a jury is? Okay, good. So, most serious felonies are tried by jury. A jury is a panel of 12 average reasonable people called to serve. Panels of juries can be vetted by lawyers. The role of judges is to direct juries, in this case on matters of law, to set the sentence. I just think you need to think, why do we have juries? Any answers? Why shouldn't we just let judges decide?
Well, the representative of the community, but also, of course, that we actually know what goes on, that they actually had a trial and there was actually, this is an open court.
Absolutely. So juries are a really important part for the community of feeling that justice has been done. Some interesting things to think about with debates like we should abolish trial by jury. Are juries actually an accurate reflection of society? It turns out the process by which juries are appointed means that people can refuse to do jury service on a long trial if pressing work commitments or otherwise call them. Juries can be vetted by the lawyers, so whole classes of people are not allowed to basically be part of the jury of the trial. So this means you don't actually always get an accurate reflection. Thinking time. Young people. Yes.
Sorry. Did you see that the guy who lost the defamation case in the paper recently got a jury of 6 women saw his case? So it's quite possible that you get entire panels made up of one demographic.
I didn't see that.
A case about depiction of provocation as a defence, having 6 women on a jury would be quite important.
Yeah, quite significant to the impact.
6 women is 6 men or 6 men?
A 6-man jury for single charge.
Yeah,
it was about decimation.
Would that
Right, I'm actually going to have to stop in 1 second, so I'm just going to do one last one. The rest of these will be online, if you want to have a look. The last factoid I just wanted to cover quickly is the difference between legalising and decriminalising, because I think this was something that people had in the debate on Monday night. There was a topic about decriminalisation, but I think it's interesting and important to understand the difference. So legalising something that was previously criminal means that society has said it's just acceptable, right? It can happen, and we will therefore, and there are no offences related to it really. So what are the benefits to society of that? It means we can set standards for how it happens. We can set frameworks in which the whole industry operates, right? So we turn it from being something that's totally illegal into becoming a regulated, taxed industry, just like any other. So you would be saying prostitution, like it is in Australia, should basically be fully legal, right? Prostitutes are required to go through government health checks. They're required to pay tax on their prostitutional salaries. Okay? Decriminalising is slightly different. Decriminalising means that you don't punish certain classes of people who partake in the activity. But a decriminalised activity doesn't actually have a fully legal way in which it can happen. Look at decriminalising drugs, right? Decriminalisation of drug use would say we won't prosecute anyone for the use or possession of drugs in small quantities. Okay, so we'll never prosecute the user, but we would still prosecute drug traffickers and people who sell drugs, dealers and traffickers and growers, right? We'll prosecute them. So there's actually no really legal way in which someone could end up owning drugs. In order to do so, it would have had to come from an illegal framework. But we focus the punishment on that illegal framework rather than on the people who are at the end of it. So the idea of decriminalisation is basically to say, well, look, it's still wrong and it's still illegal. But we shouldn't be stomping on the people who are just the pawns. We shouldn't be punishing the people who are the users of drugs or the people who are the prostitutes themselves, but rather punish the system and focus on the system that brings them down. So just the example of decriminalising the act of prostitution, right? You would still make owning a brothel illegal. You would still make pimping illegal, and you would make being a client of a prostitute illegal. But the prostitutes themselves wouldn't be doing anything illegal. So anyone who does anything with the prostitutes is doing something illegal, but that helps. And this is actually a big proposal, and in fact I think it is even in law in one of the Scandinavian countries, I can't remember which, I think in Denmark, that prostitution, no, I can't remember where, prostitution is not illegal, but to use a prostitute, Holland? Yeah, but to use a prostitute is illegal. So they prosecute the men or women who go to prostitutes. The prostitutes themselves are just provided with assistance and help to move into other careers. All right, there's a couple of other things in there on voting, on young people, on policing, and how societies decide what's a crime, but I have to stop because I have to go elsewhere. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of criminal justice system and how it can be applied to debates. Any questions?